Sometimes you just need changes in your life, like Tupac says. If you get the reference, well done, man. You know good music. And in this video, we're going to be going over that in Swift Data because your data, well, your schema in Swift Data might actually change over time. In this video, I'm going to show you how to perform migrations in Swift Data, which are either lightweight or custom. I'll also talk about how and when you actually want to perform a migration in your app, as well as some useful debugging tools. Now, by the end of this video, your migrations will be smoother than a Shake Shack milkshake, and that is the one item that's better than the milkshakes in McDonald's. Other than that, McDonald's wins and everything. So let's get into this video. So when you're actually building your applications, it's normally not normal and it always stay the same. So it's actually quite common that things change over time. Now with that, you actually don't want to just keep making changes to the same version. Instead, you should actually version your schemas so you can actually evolve them over time. So when you're actually versioning your schema, there's actually something called a migration stage. Now, migration stages essentially means how your schema, evolves. So are you performing a lightweight migration with a new version, or are you performing a custom migration with your new version as well? So you have to decide which one you want to do when you make changes to your schema. Now, in this example, when we first start off, we will look at both, but just starting off, we're going to look at lightweight migrations. Now, you might be wondering, okay, what is a lightweight migration anyway? Well, a lightweight migration is when you make small incremental changes to your schema. So some examples of this are, let's say you rename a property in your schema, you add a property, you remove a property, you change the relationship of one of your properties. These are all lightweight changes that Swift Data can actually help you automatically implement and do for you. Hence why it's called lightweight. You don't really have to do much work. It's all handled for you. So to start off, we're actually going to look into a lightweight migration, like I said before, and then look at some other examples of this later on in this video. But we're actually going to rename one of the properties within our item. But before you just jump in and have to write the code, you actually have to kind of organize this stuff within your, apps. First thing we're going to do for our first migration is actually work with something called a version schema. A version schema is exactly what the name implies. It allows you to have versioning within your models, so you can define different versions of them and you can see the changes over time. So let's first of all create a new folder here, and I'm just going to call this models. And within this folder, this is where we're going to put in all the different versions of our schema as they change over time. The first thing we're going to do here is actually create a new Swift file called version schema v1. So this is our initial version. And within here, what we now need to do is actually import Swift Data, first of all, so we can actually access that. And then I'm just going to type out the base of the file and just discuss what's going on. So when you're working with this, you need to actually use the version schema protocol, which basically allows you to mark a version and everything goes within here. This gives you two properties. Now, the first property is models. Now, within here, you just basically specify what models this version should have. So you can either add or remove models depending on your versions. And we actually have this called a version identifier. Now, with the version identifier, it's using semantic versioning. And if you don't know too much about that, I actually do have a video on my channel, which actually goes onto what semantic versioning is. But essentially, it's split into three things. So you have the major, minor, and patch. Now, because this is our first version here that we're going to be creating, we want the major to be 1 because this is the initial version. Later on in this video, we'll discuss when you'd want to set either one of these two with some actual examples. So make sure you stick around for that. Now we've got this set up here, but what we need to do is actually move all of our models that we actually have within this enum here. So our item and category needs to move in here. Now, just to keep things clean, because I don't want to put everything within this one enum here, I'm going to create an extension on to do schema version 1. And then I'm just going to copy those models into here. So we'll go to item, and I'm just going to collapse this and copy, well, not copy, but cut this and then paste it within here. And then we'll search for category and then do a similar thing where we literally cut it and just paste that below here like so. Cool. Now, if we build this, we're going to get quite a few build errors because we've just literally just took out a file and just moved it somewhere. But the first we need to do is actually import UIKit because this file doesn't know anything about UI image. And that's one of the classes that we're using to basically work with within this model. So we're going to import UI kit. Now, the problem that we've got here is that our to-do view is actually referencing item. Now, we've literally just moved item into that enum, so it doesn't actually know and it can't find that type, which is what it's saying. And it makes sense because, you know, it's not a standalone type, it's within our enum. Now, what we could do if we wanted to, we could do some namespace on all of these and do, you know, version schema 1 v1 dot item or version schema dot v1 dot category. But I'll be honest with you, I don't know if you realize by now, if you watch all my videos, I'm a pretty lazy guy. Instead, what we're going to do is actually use a little neat trick by my boy Paul, who you'll see a tweet on the screen here. And he actually suggested using type aliases to allow us to quickly reference this type. So it's kind of like a shortcut. So we don't need to update this everywhere. And just to show you some wholesome content, here's me, Paul, and the boys posing for Paul's girlfriend. But let me just get back into this video. So if we just go into here now, at the root of our application, I'm going to add in a type alias here so we can actually reference item and category quickly just using our enum. So in here, I'm just going to say mark, and I'm just going to say models. We'll just say Swift Data models. So we just got like a mark to separate it. And then type alias. And then here, we're just going to say item to do schema v1 dot item, like so. And then we'll just copy the exact same thing here, but this time do it for category, like so. Boom. So now if I build this, you should now see that all the build errors goes away because we're able to, all those views are now able to use these type aliases to either access item and or category. So we're not just done just yet with our v1, because one thing we didn't do in our enum here is actually specify what models we want to be used within version 1. Because if we don't add anything in, bro, you ain't gonna see nothing. So you don't want to miss this step. So within here, we just want to literally list the types. Now I'm just gonna say here item.self and then category.self as well. And this is referencing the item and the category from within the enum itself here. So these two models that we have within here, like so. Cool. So this is looking pretty good so far. Now, before we just dive in and just start writing the code to actually do the lightweight migration, one thing that you do want to do is actually see what your database looks like and actually test those changes between version 1, 2, 3, so on and so forth. Now, to help me do this, I'm actually going to use two tools. Now, one of them is free, one of them ain't free, and I'm not being sponsored by them. So I've actually used my own hard old cash to basically buy this tool, but I've had it for years. It's super useful. So the first thing we want to do is actually just run this on the simulator. So we'll run this, just add in a to-do of some kind. So let's just build this on the simulator. Now you need to do this on the simulator. You don't want to do this on the SwiftUI previews because you can't actually test out migrations doing that. What I'm just going to do here is just create a new to-do and routine. And I'm just going to call this record video. And then we'll just say that this is due at some point next week. Super important, because if not, you won't have anything to watch. So hit create, and then now we have our record video, like so. Cool. Ignore the ugly to do button. I just need to remove the opacity on that, but we're not gonna focus out on this video. Cool. So now, in order for us to actually see this, there's actually a tool that we need to use. So we need to access the database that's within the simulator here, and to do that, there is a tool called sim folders, which allows us to basically access files on our simulator. So I'm going to just open this up. So when we tap on this, if I actually scroll down, you'll see here that has the iPhone highlighted in green. So this is the one that's actually running right now. So what I can do is actually go to my application to-dos, and there's an option here called App Actions, Reveal Sandbox in File Viewer, and this will actually open up, the folder for the simulator. And you can actually open up user defaults as well. So this is a really useful tool to get to stuff. Now, alternatively, what you could do if you wanted to is you actually could write code and get a path and use a terminal to access that path, in your Finder, but I'm just going to use this tool. So on my other monitor here, this has opened up this folder, and you can see here that I've actually got this folder structure here. Now, in order to actually find the file of where Swift Data is storing data, what you want to do is go to Library, Application Support, and you'll see this file here called default.store. So this is actually your store for where your data is being kept. Now, I can't just open up this file and just view it like with Xcode and whatnot. You need to use some kind of database browser tool. Now, this is the free tool I was talking about. So if I right click on this and go open with over on my machine, because I've got this installed on my machine, I'm going to open it with this tool here called DB Browser for SQLite, and then choose open. And if I just drag this over from my other monitor, you'll now see that we've got this database browser, and I can actually view all of the tables that's within our app now. So right now you can see here category, Z category and Z item. So this is our item and category schema models. Now if I go to browse data, you'll see that I can go to browse data here and choose a table. So if I go to category, I can see all my categories with their, properties and the title property and whatnot. And I can go to item and view all of the items as well. So I can basically inspect my database now and debug it. So what I want you to do is just pay attention to this here called timestamp, because what we're going to do is actually rename this from timestamp to something called due date, because right now, in my opinion, calling it timestamp doesn't really make sense because it's actually a due date for when you need to do the to-do. So we're going to rename this column here. We're going to need to, first of all, create a new version of our to-do schema. So in our file here, or folder, we're going to create a v2 of this file. So we're going to say version schema v2. And then I'm literally going to be lazy here and just copy everything in this file and then paste it all in here, rename this to v2. And we want to change the enum here to be v2 because we can't have v1 twice. Cool. Now, because we're only changing the name of a property here, we actually don't want to just make this 2.00. It doesn't make sense. It's not a major change. And also as well, it's not new functionality. So we don't want to update the minor. Mine went blank there. We don't want to update the minor. Instead, what we want to do is update the patch because it's a small incremental change. So we're going to update this to be 1.0.1 instead. Now, something else we need to do as well is actually rename that column name or that property timestamp to due date. So here, we actually want to change this to due date. Now, in order to do that, you actually have to use the attributes property in Swift Data. There's a parameter called original name, and this allows you to specify the old name it used to, and then you just change the property name to the new name. So we're going to say here at attribute, and then we're going to use original name, like so. And then we want this to be timestamp because that's the old name. That's reference. So this is referencing the property in our version 1 schema. So this isn't just a random old name you're using. This is actually the property in your version 1 schema. And then now you specify here the new name, and we're going to call this due date, like so. Cool. Now, when you run this, you're going to get a whole bunch of errors, and I expect that. But before we fix these errors, the next one we need to do is actually update our item type alias to use this v2 schema, because we don't want to be saving data using v1 anymore. We want to be saving data using v2. So let's go into our root app. And we'll change this from v1 to v2. Now, before you do anything else, it's super important that you make sure that all your models are referencing the latest version of the schema that you want to use, right? So we'll get a whole bunch of issues here. I fully expect that. Now, to fix this, all I'm going to do is just find the references of timestamp and change them to due date, except from within the version schema 1 file, because we don't want to change it in there. So this file, we're going to ignore it. But in our content view, to-do view, and all our other views, we're going to make sure that we're working with due date. So we're going to leave this as timestamp and due date. But here in our initializer, this should now be due date. So I'm going to update that here. Now in our coding key here within our model, so this is using our default JSON file from our pre-fill video that I went over in this course. I'm just going to leave that in our JSON file so we don't have to keep on writing code to migrate the JSON file. So we're just going to leave that alone. But when we're actually trying to decode it, we're going to set our due date rather than it being timestamp, because that's what we renamed the property to. So let's just keep working through this. In our encode here as well, we're going to replace timestamp, but leave it for the key. So the key will be timestamped. It's just that the property will be called due date. Then in our content view, we're going to be working with due date now and not timestamp. Our comparison will now be timestamp. Sorry, our comparison will now be due date. Text here will also be due date. Due date. In our modify, to do file, due date. I don't actually need this original to do. We don't use it, so I'm going to delete that. Okay, cool. Let's see if we got any references anywhere else. So we got it on our binding here. Change that to due date. Okay, awesome. So now I build, it succeeds and it's all good. Cool. Now you may be thinking, all right, can I run it now? And the answer is no. So we still got a few more things that we need to do, right? So we actually need to write the code for actually setting up a lightweight migration. So that's something that we're going to do. And we still need to look through other migration types, which we're going to cover later on in this video. Now, if you're enjoying this video so far, I'd really appreciate it if you gave it a thumbs up, and let me know in the comment section down below what other type of videos you want to see as well. So we actually need to write the code to actually help us move from our, version 1 to version 2. And in order to do this, you need to use something called a migration plan. So this is literally you telling Swift Data to migrate from these versions. So in the root of our application, if you wanted to, you could put this in a separate file, but I'm just going to put it here. And I'm just going to say mark migration plan, so we can just see it with our, setup. Now in here, we're going to need to actually create the skeleton for this. So I'm going to add this in and we'll break it down. So you actually have to use the schema migration plan protocol, which gives you two properties. And the first one is the schemas. So these are the version schemas that we created. We have to list them out in here, and the migration stage as well. So these are the stages. Now, the first we want to do in here is actually specify a list of all of our version schemas. So I'm going to say here to do v1, and then we're going to say here to do schema v2, like so. So now we've done this, we actually need to create the migration stage that allows us to migrate from v1 to v2. Now below our stages here, I'm going to specify, well, we'll type this out together, but I'm going to specify our first lightweight migration. So let's go here and we'll just type in here static let, and I'm going to say migrate v1 to v2. So that's what we're going to call this. And then we're just going to say migration stage dot lightweight. Now, when you're working with lightweight, all you need to do is to specify the from and the schema that you want to migrate to. So pretty straightforward. So I'm just going to create a bit of space so you can see this a bit easier. And then for our from, we're just going to use our to do version schema 1 v1 dot self, and then our to will be v2 dot self, like so. Cool. And that's all we need to do for lightweight, to specify the two, and Swift Data is smart enough to figure out the differences and make the changes for us. Now, right now, if I was to run this, nothing would happen because we don't actually use the migration plan anywhere, and we're not actually specifying these stages. So after you created this, you want to actually use this within your stages here, like so, to tell it explicitly to use this migration stage of a lightweight. The final thing we need to do is actually set up our, migration plan within our container. Now, I actually have this container here that pre-fills items. So if you just go into this function, when you set up a custom container, like we did in our previous video, there is a parameter that you can use to help you basically specify a migration plan. So to use this enum that we just created a second ago. So I'm now going to go into here in the middle here and use migration plan, and it takes in that. And we're going to say to do migration plan dot self, like so. Cool. So now we have everything set up. I can actually run this and then we can actually inspect our database to see, well, inspect our storage to see if it's actually renamed that column from timestamp to due date. So I'm going to run this again. And you can see that the app hasn't crashed, so it looks like it's all good. I can still interact with it. Seems like it's all fine. But this time now, I'm going to close the database and I'm going to reopen up this file that I had, well, from within this directory from when we used sim folders. And I'm going to open this up again with our browser. And if I go to browse data and then go to our item, you'll now see that it's actually not called timestamp anymore. It's now called due date. So this is now successfully migrated from V1 to V2. And when we run our app, it will always be using V2 going forward. So something else that I want to do in our app is that if you actually look at it, I want to add the ability for someone to actually either flag or archive to do. Because right now we can only delete. I might want to add a archive, and we're going to be using these features later on in another video within this course in the future. So we're just doing the groundwork for that now. Now, we can't actually use a lightweight migration for that. And the reason why is because our, Swift Data isn't smart enough to know what we want to do with, if it's archived or if it's flagged. So what we need to do instead is actually use something called a custom migration. And the reason why is because the custom migration will allow us to specify the code that we want to execute when we do this migration. Now you might be wondering, all right, Tons, what code are you even referring to? Well, think about it. Right now, when we've launched our app, right now, if I've actually got the app installed on a device, I've already got to-do saved. If I was to add a new property of is flagged and is archived, those properties will probably more than likely not be set with a value already. So what I need to do is actually clean up my data store and actually set those properties manually with a value of false. Now, if you create a brand new to-do going forward when we do this migration, by default, they will be false. But for existing to-dos, it will actually be nil. And if you were to access this property, there's a high possibility that your app will crash. So we're going to create a V3 of our version schema. So I'm just going to create that now. And what we want to do is actually copy the content of our V2 into this file. So I'm going to go to V2, copy all of this, and then paste it within here like so. Cool. Now it's going to complain because obviously we can't have two V2s. So we're going to change this to V3 like so. Cool. And then now, before we just start adding in the is flagged and is archived to our item model, the first thing we need to do is actually change our version identifier. Now, right now, this is version 1.0.1. Now, this would be a good case for us to go to 1.1. And the reason why is because our existing app doesn't have archiving and flagging as a feature. So they are brand new features. So I'm going to change this to 0 and increase this by 1. Cool. Now down below in our item, we're now going to add two new properties called is flagged and is archived. And we're going to set them both to false by default. So any new to-do items will always have these two set to false. They won't be, set to true at all. If you did want to, tweak that and change it, I personally would recommend that within the decoder, I would just basically modify those values within the decoder here and just set it to a random value. But we're not going to be doing that in this video. Now, like I said before, whenever you make changes to your model and you want to migrate to a new version, you always want to update the root of your app that's, referencing your types. So I'm going to change this to V3 rather than it being V2 like so. And now we're at a stage where we can actually start to create our custom migration plan. So the next thing we're going to need to do now is actually update our migration plan to include our V3 and also create a migration stage, which is using of type custom. So I'm going to first of all add in our V3 into this array. And then now within our migration stages, what we're going to do is we're going to have to create a new migration version to go to V2 to V3. So below here, we're going to say static let migrate V2 to V3. And this time, when we use migration stage, we're going to select custom. Now, when you're working with a custom migration stage, you'll see there's a whole bunch of parameters that you can use. Now, the first thing we're going to do is just fill out the from and the to, and then I'm going to discuss the differences between will migrate and did migrate. Cool. So we want to migrate from to do schema v2 to do schema v3.self, which is pretty self-explanatory. But now we have these two closures here. So we have will migrate and did migrate. Now will migrate will run before the migration has happened. When would you want to use this? Well, let's say, for example, if you need to clean up some data before you actually do a migration, i.e. removing duplicates. If you want to make a new property unique, then you want to do that here. And did migrate is after the migration has happened. Now, in our case, we want to use did migrate because what I want to do is any existing to-do items, I want to set the archived and flagged to false by default. So we're going to pass in nil here. And then in our did migrate, we'll get a context as a parameter within the closure. And then within here, I'm going to fetch all of the existing items, well, to do items, and set those properties. So I'm going to type this out and we'll break it down. So what we're just saying here is I'm just executing a fetch request to basically get all of the items within our 2v3 schema. So you can see here, I'm referencing our version 3 schema with our models to get those items. Now, the reason why I'm not using that type alias is because I don't want to risk the fact of someone changing this to v2 and then this messing up. So I'm going to be super explicit and use that here. And then we just loop through all of the items, set the defaults, and then save it. Pretty much it. Cool. So now we've done this, the next thing we want to do is actually set this to v3. So we're going to say migrate v2 to v3. And we've got pretty much everything set up now where we've got our custom migration plan. So let's run this and see what happens. So as you can see, our app looks fine. I can modify it and it's all working fine. And you can now see as well that before we just inspect our database, when you're specifying your stages, depending on the order that you pass in is the way that it migrates. You can see we've done V1 to V2 and V2 to V3. So we've now got an order of our migration stages. If I actually go back again and actually open up that file, that allows me to see the storage. So we'll go to library, application support, default store. If I just go to the DB browser, if I just go to browse data and then go to item, you'll now see that we actually have two new columns here called is archived and is flagged. So this is here, and all of them, all of these existing items are actually set to false by default. Cool. So one of the things I want to do is actually show you how we can actually use our new property from our v3 model to actually set an item as flagged. So if we just go into our content view, there's actually a swipe action here. So I just collapse this V stack. We actually do have the swipe actions. Now, right now we have edit, but what I want to do is actually add a swipe action in for flagging and unflagging an item. So I'm going to just, first of all, change edit to be yellow, just so it's a different color. I'm going to change that to yellow. And I'm now going to add in a new swipe action called flagging. So on the button, we'll come back to that in a second. But for flagging, I want this to be orange. Cool. Now we're still going to use this label, but what we're going to do in the label is depending on whether the item is flagged or not, we're going to change the text and the system image. So as you can see here on the label, if the item is flagged, then we're going to use the text unflag. If it isn't flagged, then we'll use flag. And depending on whether it's flagged or not, we'll change whether it's a flag with a slash or just a normal flag. And we'll use the fill symbol variant as well. Now within our button action, what we want to do is say item.isFlagged. And then we're going to toggle that so we can toggle it between true and false. Cool. Now we've got this in as a swipe action, but we don't have anything on our user interface to show the user that this item is a flagged item. So on our VStack, instead of us having this here like so, I'm now going to add in a HStack. I'm just pasting the is critical. And then within here, if the item is flagged in the curly braces, we're just going to add in a SS symbol with that. Cool. So now we actually have all of this in place. I'm just going to clean this up a bit. And if I just go back to that, we now have this. Now I'm going to give you all a bit of a warning, right? Because I'm pretty sure this is a bug in Xcode, because this was not happening to me before in previous versions of Xcode. But when you're adding and removing items within a list, there seems to be a bit of a choppiness that you'll see in a second. So it's not me, it's Xcode for some reason. I've already filed a field feedback, so hopefully they, fix it. And if you could file a field feedback as well, I'd really appreciate it, because right now I don't know why it's choppy in the betas. But anyway, let's just run this now. And let's just say, for example, if I want to, flag to go and get a wedding suit, you'll now see that it flags the item, and you see that weird animation, defo and Xcode beta bug. And if I want to unflag it, I can unflag the item as well, and it unflags it too. But if I go to, maybe go visit family and flag it, you'll see that it's fine. And, we got our flag there. If I unflag it, it's all good. So the fact that it doesn't do that choppiness when I'm doing that swipe action lets me know that this is probably an Xcode beta bug. But what I do want to do is just flag this again. And I'm not going to unflag it. I just want to go into our database, and then I'm just going to refresh it. And the item that we flagged was go and get wedding suit. So I just find that here. So this row right here, you'll now see that is flagged is set to 1, which basically means that it's true. So we've got flagging working. Now in future videos, we're actually going to look at how to use the archive functionality to add archiving into this app. But if you enjoy these videos and want to learn more about Swift Data, then definitely check out this playlist on the screen, which is actually part of this course. And it basically goes over everything that you need to know to get started with Swift Data. And I also have more courses on my website, which is actually in the description box below. And you can actually check that out as well. That's everything from me. I'll catch you all in a bit. Deuces.